So the next section of this chapter is the movement and the role of the peripheral nervous system in movement. All right, so trying to make my screen look. There we go. All right, so CNS to PNS, motor output. Right, so we know that we have upper motor neurons, neurons of the primary motor cortex, which make the decision to move, initiate that movement. They're not in contact with the muscle fiber. Then you have the lower motor neurons, which receive the message from your upper motor neurons, right? They are in contact with the skeletal muscle fibers, release acetylcholine onto the muscle fibers, right? That's a neurotransmitter, acetylcholine, to the muscle fibers to initiate contraction. Right, so this motor output, this movement is, so once that sensory signal is sent to the brain, it may just say, okay, I'm touching the drumsticks, but then I have my upper motor neurons that works sending signals to my lower motor neurons, which are in contact with my biceps, muscles in my arms, and actually tell me to now play the rhythm, right? So your lower motor neurons, and this would be in your peripheral nervous system, are multipolar neurons whose cell bodies are in either the anterior horn of spinal cord or the brainstem axons, and the axons are in the PNS. Okay, and then you have motor neuron pools, which it talks about here, groups of lower motor neurons that innervate same muscle. All right, so it's not just one nerve that goes to a muscle. You'll have multiple nerves that go to a muscle. They'll be clustered in the anterior horn. Remember, the anterior horn is where the motor function comes out of your spinal cord. Right? And in that motor neuron pool, you can have large motor neurons. Majority of these neurons within the pool stimulate skeletal muscle fibers. And then you have smaller motor neurons innervate intrafusal fibers, part of the specialized stretch receptors, right? So just telling you the different structures, locations of different neurons that work in the motor version of the motor section of the peripheral nervous system. Right? So your upper motor neurons, so number one, upper motor neurons in the premotor cortex, the cerebral cortex, select a certain motor program, tell your body what it's going to do. Then the basal nuclei, right? Basal nuclei enable the thalamus to stimulate the upper motor neurons. That's your diencephalon of the primary motor, upper motor neurons of the primary motor cortex, right? So they're all at play there. Right. Now 3 says your upper motor neurons stimulate lower motor neurons. So it sends a signal down to your lower motor neurons. These are your lower motor neurons. These are the ones that are actually connected to the muscle. And now we've gone to your PNS. Your lower motor neurons stimulate a skeletal muscle to contract. Right? And that's how the process works. Right? And that's just kind of showing you the whole picture. Upper motor neurons from your cerebral cortex to your basal nuclei, thalamus, down your spinal cord, to your lower motor neuron, which connects to your skeletal muscle. All right, very simply put. And then we have the last section, I'll go ahead, and the last section is 13.6 reflex arcs, and we've talked about these a little bit already. And that's sort of the integration between sensory and motor functions. Remember when lab, you sit on the edge of the table, hit the edge of the knee moves. So I hit the edge of the knee, there's a slight indentation on my patellar tendon. It's a stretch reflex. It sends a signal via my sensory to my spinal cord, which doesn't actually go through the brain. It sends a signal right back to the through the motor, and causes the quadricep to contract. So just since we've already talked about stretch sort of reflexes a little bit, I'm going to kind of go through this quickly. So we have mechanoreceptors and muscles and tendons monitor muscle length, force of contraction, communication information to spinal cord, cerebellum, and cerebral cortex. You have different muscle spindles, tapered structures found scattered among regular contractile muscle fibers, right? So you have these muscle spindles that are active. Two structural and functional classes of sensory neurons innervate these fibers. Your primary afferents respond to stretch. So when something stretches, so when you hit the edge of the knee and it indents that patellar tendon, it actually stretches the quadricep just a little bit. And then that sends a signal to jerk it back, and then you kick the leg. Same thing happens if I'm holding, if I'm holding something in my hands and then you drop something else on top of it, my muscle feels that sort of that stretch and bounces back, right? So you have primary afferents at play, secondary afferents, afferent and sensory, efferent, motor, remember that? Secondary afferents respond to both static length of muscle and position of limb. You also have Golgi tendon organs, mechanoreceptors located within the tendons. These monitor tension generated by the muscle contraction. So when we tap the knee, we're actually tapping the patellar tendon. We're not actually tapping the quadricep. We're tapping the patellar tendon, which is then sends a signal to via sensory, comes back via motor to your quadricep muscle. Okay. And that's, so these receptors are inside, in the muscle, sensory receptors, and are located in the muscle. And then you also have these motor neurons which stimulate the muscle. So your body can, like, I know with my eyes closed, I know if more weight has been added, or I know, or without even thinking, my body can respond, to these different reflexes based on these different receptors, these nerve receptors that are built into the muscle. So what is a reflex? A reflex is a programmed automatic response to stimuli. And this is what I really want you to drive home to know. Occurs in a reflex arc, right? Usually protective, negative feedback loops. Reflexes begin with a sensory stimulus, right? So I tap the knee, sensory stimulus, and finish with a rapid motor response. That rapid motor response would be your knee kicking, right? You tap it, your body senses this slight stretch, and you kick the leg. Neural integration between sensory stimulus and motor response occurs in the CNS at spinal cord or brainstem. So it goes through the spinal cord or the brainstem, doesn't actually go into your cerebrum, right? All right, so part one, sensory afferent, tap the knee, my body senses that tap. Part two, CNS integrates the stimulus. 3, the PNS delivers the motor response, right? So you really don't have to think about it, necessarily contemplate it, your body delivers a response, right? And that's what gives us a reflex arc. So a programmed response to a specific stimulus. So I tap the knee, I don't have to think, kick my leg, my body already has a programmed response that when it stretches like that, it's gonna engage the quadricep to kick. And that's how you can test. So what am I testing when I do that tap? When the doctor does that tap, he's testing the ability to go from sensory to CNS to motor. He's testing that he's testing your nervous system basically. And to see if there's any problem with your nervous system, remember the part of your nervous system that deals with your knee, for instance, is the lower part of your spinal cord, the lumbar and sacral region of your spinal cord. And remember, and so if I tap down there and I'm sending a signal through your spinal cord and then back to your motor version, the motor nerves back to your quadricep, then that tells me everything above that section in your spinal cord is working properly, correct? Because if I injure my spinal cord here, everything below it would stop working. So if I test my spinal cord way down here, that means everything above here, as far as we know, is probably functioning properly. So I can do that test, which you sit on the edge of the table, and tell you, for the most part, your central nervous system is functioning properly. That's why we do the test. That's what I want you to understand, the importance of a reflex arc, right? So what is it? You have the sensory, you're sending a signal to the spinal cord, to the central nervous system. You don't have to think about it. It's a programmed automatic response. It sends a signal right back down to the muscle in the same leg and tells it to kick, right? So it's sending a signal through my whole central nervous system that's programmed. And so it can tell me if that whole pathway is nice and connected. And from one little tap on the knee, I can tell you that you have no paralysis in your nervous system, in your central nervous system. So, right, there's no, at least the spinal cord and the brain are not injured, okay? All right, there's different types of reflexes, and I'm not gonna go into too many details with this. I just kind of want you to understand the concept of reflexes. So reflexes can be classified by the number of synapses or the type of organ in which a reflex takes place. Monosynaptic reflexes, a single synapse. You can have a synapse just in the spinal cord where it doesn't actually go through the brain or through the brainstem. You also have polysynaptic reflexes, have multiple synapses. That means multiple neurons. Remember, synapse is where a neuron connects with another neuron. You have the stretch reflexes. And what I want you to, we've talked about these in lab already, but just take some time and read through these different reflexes, patellar knee jerk reflexes. And it's kind of cool to read this slide and to look at the different reflexes there and how our body responds. I like this. This is when I keep talking about if I have something in my hand and add something to it and my body naturally snaps back. That's pretty cool. Golgi tendon reflexes, flexion, withdrawal, and cross extension spinal reflexes. And these are really cool, especially if you decide to get into any type of work with the body, right? Different types of stretch reflexes, even cranial nerves reflex, your gag reflex, something goes in the back of your throat. If you stick your toothbrush too far back, you automatically gag. That's a reflex, right? You have blink reflexes. If something gets into your eye, you don't even have to think about it. Your eye naturally blinks. It's like a piece of dust gets in your eye. It's also a reflex. All right, and then I have a slide about Lou Gehrig's disease, which is degeneration of cell bodies. And then that's the end of the chapter. Enjoy. Study this, read this, and hopefully enjoy it.